My job is to welcome you here to Trinity today. I'm not one of the fantastic speakers that you've come to listen to today, so I'm going to keep it brief. And you are indeed most welcome here today. I just want to say that if you were to ask me the difference between your school and coming to college or university, I might say a couple of things to you. The first is that here nobody checks your homework the next day. Nobody gives you detention if you miss a class. And really here in college, people are free to study whatever they want to study. So whatever it is that you're interested in personally, whether you love dinosaurs or whether you want to be a vet or whether you would love to be a pilot or perhaps be a writer, or whether you're really fascinated by the Incas of South America, or you love the idea of studying tsunamis or the solar system, or even if you really just like looking at films. Here in a college you get to choose what it is that you want to study, what you want to love, what you love and what you want to study, and you get to work with people who love that as well. And really colleges and universities at their best are about ideas and inspiring you to do what you want throughout your career. So all I really want to say to you is that I hope that you enjoy the talks today. I hope that you enjoy the day here in Trinity. You're most welcome here on the campus today. You're always welcome to come back, whether as visitors, but hopefully also sometime in the future as students here to do what you love doing. So what I'll do now is I'll hand the microphone over to my friend Tom Donegan from Children's Books Ireland, who will do an introduction for the speakers themselves. Thank you and enjoy the day.
Hello everybody. I'm not going to speak very long today because there are some very, very interesting people who are here sitting to my left who are going to be talking to you at greater length. However, I would just like to say on behalf of Children's Book Ireland that it is a real honour to be present as part of Trinity Week here and assisting the Trinity College in hosting such a wonderful event. Sometimes when we go about the country doing our work, we have the opportunity to work with one or maybe two authors. But believe me, I've never had the chance to introduce three speakers of such fantastic credibility as the men sitting next to me today. So just to very quickly tell you who's here and what's going to happen. To my left initially is Oisin McGann, then we have Conor Kostick, and at the end Mr. Philip Reeve. Now all of these writers have published countless books that have sold in their hundreds and thousands in countries all across the world, and they've also been nominated and won very, very many very prestigious awards. But a lot of people maybe sitting out here today might be thinking, science fiction, you know, what is it? What does it mean? Can I just ask a quick question? Who here or whose parents have a mobile phone? Now, the mobile phone was an idea that was dreamt up by a science fiction writer years before any technologists or scientists came up with the physical ways of doing it. Who likes to play computer games? Exactly the same thing. Virtual reality computer games dreamt up by a science fiction writer. And last of all, who has a laser gun at home? Now you're messing. No one has a laser gun at home. But that was also an idea that was first conceived by a science fiction writer. So the men here, not only have they written and published many wonderful books, they also have the incredible ability to see into the future. So I'm going to ask them to each come up and speak to you a little bit about their work. But listen very carefully, because you might actually pick up on the next big thing. And if you're kind of ahead of the game, you might be able to listen to their ideas. And, you know, maybe when you come to go through university and out into the world of work, you might use some of those ideas to become millionaires and inventors yourselves. So without further ado, I would ask the builders at the back to maybe be quiet during the event. I would just ask anyone with mobile phones to turn them off, please. I would notify you that the emergency exits, if you need them, are just the doors you came through here and here and here. And finally, last but not least, I'd ask you to give a very, very big warm welcome to our three speakers today. Machine McGann.
Can you hear me okay? I'm wearing one of those funny mics that actually attached to your body. A little bit where you might hear my heartbeat going thump, thump, thump. I'm going to walk right past the podium going over here. I'm going to draw while I talk. Well, I'm going to try and draw while I talk. This is where technology could fail you. Thanks to Tom for the introduction, and CBI and for Trinity for having us. When I started writing stories, I was about 6 or 7, and because I was only 6 or 7, all the books that I wrote had pictures. And some of this is going to be faint at the start, but you'll get the idea. So I thought that all books had to have pictures. I thought that was the way it worked, and I thought if you were going to write stories, you had to draw pictures to go with the stories. So I started drawing pictures with Omar, filling copybooks with pictures. And can you all see that okay? Yeah? Okay. And I still think that books should have pictures. You know, they don't have to have, they can be like novels, they can have just pictures on the front, or they can have an odd picture here and there. But we have a funny attitude in Ireland and the UK to pictures. We tend to think of pictures as like stabilizers on your bike. That you know, you only need them for as long as you're learning to read, and then once you can read, you can, that looks all right. Once you can read, you can just take them off. You can get rid of the pictures, you know, because pictures are really for kids. You know, for people who can't read very well. You know, some pictures just for people who are a bit dim, really. And I always thought this was kind of a shame, and it only applies to books for some reason. You know, if you have, hands up if you've ever seen a newspaper. Ah, right, yeah, a lot of you seen a newspaper. Right, I mean, newspaper would be full of pictures. But if you saw your dad, you know, sitting there reading a newspaper, you wouldn't go up to him and say, "Ah, Dad, what are you reading that for? Would you not read something more fitting for your age? Look at it. It's full of pictures. It's got pictures on every page. Some of those pictures are in colour. What's wrong with you? You're not very able to read very well." Or you see your mother reading Cosmopolitan magazine, and you think, "God, Mum, some of those pictures, some of those pages only have one word on them, you know, or two Christian Dior. You know, what's wrong with you? You're not able to read." So, but if we do the same thing in books for some reason, it's considered childish to have pictures in a book. And I always thought that this was a shame. So, people always ask writers, why, you know, what started you writing? What inspired you to write? And for me, it was always the thing of, I just loved that feeling when I was young, when I would sit there or lie there late at night. You know, when you're in bed and you're lying and maybe the wind is blowing against the window, maybe the rain's blowing against the window, and you're reading by the light of a lamp. It's a bit like this, you know, you have a little lamp reading, you're sitting there, and your mother's told you to go to sleep 3 times already, and you're sitting there and you just think, right, just one more page. Just one more page. Oh, I just finished the chapter, there's only 2 more pages. Oh, 1 more page after this. Oh, there's only 2 more pages left. Oh, if the sentence ends at the bottom of the page, I'll stop there, otherwise I'll go on to the next page. And I just love that feeling. And then you'd end up finishing the book simply, you know, 3 o'clock in the morning, simply because you could not put it down. And I love that feeling. I love the feeling that these writers gave me. And I thought if I could give that same feeling to other people, that would just be the biggest buzz. And I loved stories, not just in books, but also in films and in television. I just loved any kind of story. And that was what got me into writing. What nobody told me about writing is that nobody pays you to write your first book. You kind of have to spend hours and hours and days and sometimes years and years writing a book without getting paid for it and without somebody giving you the time to do it. Which came as a bit of a shock. And frankly, I got to my mid-20s and I was writing all the time. And I thought, actually, if I'm going to get published, I suppose I should try and write a book. So I sat down and I had to kind of I moved to London, I had to get a job as a security guard. I was guarding trains, parked trains in a train depot. I can tell you that's an exciting job. I was an exceptional security guard, not a single train was stolen while I was on duty. And I wrote my first book sitting in a security cabin at night, 12-hour shifts, guarding trains. So that was how I started off. And eventually got published, and I thought, right, that's it. Look, here comes fame and glory. This is going to be brilliant. I'll be rich. I'll be famous. I'll just kind of, you know, I won't have to do anything else. I'll just sit there and write stories. And it was at that point that somebody came and explained to me, no, you actually have to go out and help the book sell. You have to talk to people. I don't want to talk to people. That's why I write it down. I've no interest in particularly no interest in talking to children, and particularly young children. Young children ask daft questions like, I was doing a session once and I said any questions and one of them stuck up their hand and went, can I go to the toilet? Or they might ask you, how much money do you make? Which most adults would actually like to ask, but they don't have the nerve. Or they'll kind of say, have you ever drawn any naked people? Or one kid who kind of cornered me in a school corridor one time and he said, here, can I have your autograph? Who are you? So, but I learned to deal with all these questions, and I learned to deal with, particularly very young kids, because when you're reading to young kids, nobody told me that young kids don't know to respond. They don't know that you need to know that they're listening. They don't show it. So young kids will quite happily sit there listening to a story going, or they'll have their head on the desk. So I had to learn how to deal with all of that. It was interesting, but it was a slow process. We learned all this stuff. But I wanted to be one of those reclusive writers. I wanted to be one of those writers who kind of, lives up in a hill and grows a long beard and runs around with a shotgun telling people to get off their land. That was what I wanted to be. So, but I didn't get that way. You have to kind of get out there and you have to tell people about your books, and there's a lot more involved than just kind of sitting there writing books. Much as I wish I could just sit and kind of draw and write all day. So, one of the things that all these visits emphasised for me was the importance of empathy. Can anybody tell me what empathy means? Hands up. Somebody in the back there. To know what somebody's feeling. Yeah, sort of. So you share somebody else's feelings. It's where somebody has a feeling and you know how that feels. And this is something that's really important for writers, because you have to be able to know. You have to be able to. Your readers have to know what you're feeling. You have to get that across in your stories and what your characters are feeling. And if they don't feel what the characters are feeling, they won't care what's going on. So you have to make that happen. And when I was your age, I liked a good horror story. Hands up if you like horror. Yeah, or a bit of blood and gore and violence. Yeah, I did too. But I learned later on that if you want your readers, and I still like a bit of blood and gore and violence, to be honest. I haven't grown up really. But I learned that if you're going to write stories that people will really kind of love and really kind of get into, you have to have things happening in the stories that people can relate to. And you could very easily have a scene where, like any of these horror films, where you have some teenage girl running down a corridor and some guy's chasing her with an axe, and she's screaming and she's running down and she's normally blonde, and he runs after her and she tries one door and then tries another door, and then they're all locked, and eventually he catches her and chops her head off, right? Now, I used to love those kinds of stories. But I realised that none of my readers had ever had their heads chopped off. I'm pretty sure none of you had your heads chopped off. It's not an experience that you can get over, really. So I realised actually what really makes people experience something, make it seem real, is stuff that they've actually had happen to them. So you can imagine, if you're, say you're looking at a nail, and you're looking at a hammer, and you're looking at the nail, and you're about to hammer the nail in, and you're looking at the hammer, looking at the nail, hammer, nail, hammer, nail. Thumb is very close to the top of the nail. Hammer, down, BANG! Everybody knows what it's like to whack their finger on something. As children we walked around sticking our fingers into things like plug sockets and doors and making our parents run over. And so people can understand what it's like to have their finger crushed on something. That's the kind of thing we can relate to. But it's like if you've ever stubbed your toe. Hands up if you've ever stubbed your toe. Everybody stubbed your toe. You might even have stubbed your toe on the corner of your bed in your bedroom, which has been in your life, where you've been walking around for years. Maybe you come home late at night and you're very tired, and you come home and this bed, you know where it's been. You've been walking around it. You can find it in the dark. You can go to the toilet in the middle of the night, and for some reason, on this day, you whack your toe off the leg of the bed. Right? You kind of just walk along, there's the leg. Ah! Everybody's done that at one time. I once hit my toe. I was going to the loo in the middle of the night, and there was a sliding door, and there was a little peg at the bottom of the door, and I hit my toe off that peg. I actually hit it so hard, I split my toe open. That's the reaction I wanted from my readers. So that was the kind of thing I had to learn how to use, this empathy, this kind of finding things that people could relate to. That was the kind of thing I used to love. So, I'm just kind of finishing up here. Can you all see that okay? Yeah. I'll move over here. Switch this over. Grand. So, I'm going to read you, how are we doing for time? 5 minutes. I'm going to read you a couple of pieces. This is from Wired Teeth. Most of my ideas come from normal things, ordinary things that you see every day, and I give them a twist, or I exaggerate them, or I make them a bit weird, or I put something weird in a normal situation, or I put something normal in a very weird situation. And it's a very easy way to generate ideas. Sometimes we sit there and we wait for ideas to come to us and we get inspired, and people think that writers just sit here and we get ideas coming to us all the time. But most of the time it's work. Most of the time we have to have means of getting ideas. And this idea came from, it's called Wired Teeth. And it came from an idea when I was a teenager. I heard this rumor that people who had braces could pick up radio signals, which actually isn't true. But if you think about the antenna of a radio is metal, so maybe you can get tingling in your teeth. Now, I think most of you are probably too young for braces, but some of you, it's all ahead of you. Now, I don't think you're going to be picking up Today FM or anything. But anyway, this boy, he's a nasty bully, and he got these really fancy braces because he's the worst teeth in the world. And he starts hearing things. And what happens is he stumbled across this plot that's going on in the school. There's always plots going on in schools. He was afraid that the kids would laugh at him because he has these mad braces, when actually, half the kids have braces themselves anyway. But he's so afraid, he's so worried about being cool all the time that he picks on one of the weaker kids to show how mean he is. And he thinks that will make everybody else afraid of him. So he's just finished doing that, and now he's going to go and talk to his friends. Making an example of Finton worked. Nobody said a thing about his braces until break time, when the 5 lads who made up his posse gathered round to check out Dr. Shapiro's handiwork. Sorry, this boy's name is Jason. They look serious, Vince whistled. Do they hurt? Not much, Jason said casually. Do they catch on the inside of your cheeks? Tony asked. He had train tracks, and sometimes they cut the inside of his mouth. No, Jason replied. I mean, they feel really big in my mouth. They're not sticking out anywhere, The guy said they were like future technology kind of thing. He explained how they worked by remote control. The lads were suitably impressed. Cool, said Vince. There was a crackling sound, and then, orange, this is indigo. Subject alpha is engaging in social interaction with his associates. Situation normal. What? Jason grunted. What? Vince asked. Who said that about engaging in social whatchamacallit? Jason retorted. What are you talking about? Roger that, indigo. Orange, out. Jason flinched and looked at the questioning faces of his posse. You didn't hear that. Hear what? Tony asked, a sly smile forming on his face. Jason knew that smile and the sideways glance towards the others. He knew it because he did it often enough himself. Tony was getting ready to slag him. You don't hear that, Jason pressed him. He put his hand to his ear and then held his palm out to Tony. Here, listen. On reflex, Tony turned his ear towards the hand to listen, and Jason slapped him lightly on the face. That's the sound of you looking like an idiot. The other boys laughed, and Jason cackled with them, but his eyes were casting fearfully round. The subjects are laughing at a practical joke. I have to go to the jacks, Jason sputtered. Back in a sec. He sauntered away, trying not to look bothered, but there was no mistaking that voice he had heard. Why hadn't the other lads heard it too? He needed a bit of time on his own to think. As he strode through the door, the Singh twins were coming out. Jason gave them a surreptitious glance and brushed past them. Was that a surreptitious glance you just gave us, J.O.? Anita asked. And he brushed past us too, Sonia added. You're supposed to hold the door open for girls. Didn't you know that? They both gave him the same smug smile at exactly the same time. Too distracted to come up with anything smart to say, he slammed the door on them and made a face, pressing his nose against the window. Mind you don't crack the glass, Anita chirped, and then they skipped away together. Those Singh twins, he couldn't figure them out. Barging into the boys' toilets, he hurried into one of the cubicles, bolted the door, and sat down on the loo seat. Something weird was going on, and he didn't know what. He let out an exasperated sigh. With nobody around, he felt safe. He stuck his finger up his nose, rooted round for a good lump, and then licked the snot off his fingertip. Orange, this is Mauve. Subject Alpha has moved to the boys' toilets. He is currently picking his nose. Jason stood up with a jolt, staring around at the walls of the cubicle, up at the ceiling, and down at the gap under the door. Roger that, Mauve. Keep me posted. Orange, out. Who's there? He shrieked. I'll rip your flippin' heads off if you're messing with me. What do you want? I just want to go to the toilet. A small child's fearful voice squeaked from the next cubicle. "But I can't while you're shouting at me!" His cheeks hot and flushed with embarrassment, Jason threw the door open and rushed back to his classroom. So that's Wired Teeth. This is a very different type of book. This is The Wisdom of Dead Men. It's the sequel to another book I've written called The Ancient Appetites. And it's about a very nasty family. This family think it's okay to get ahead by killing each other, right? So, and they have rules. You can't do it any other way. It has to be done in a civilized fashion, right? You can't go and kill anybody you like. You can only kill up. You can only kill the older man above you. So if you have a younger brother, you can't kill him, no matter how much you dislike him. You can kill him in self-defense, but that's all right. And the girls aren't allowed to do any killing. But they have other ways of getting to do what they want to do. But sometimes if the women disobey, because this is set in the old times, in Victorian times in Ireland, and women had a hard time back then. There was an awful lot they couldn't do. They couldn't own property, they couldn't vote, they couldn't take part in government. So in this family, the women had to find other ways of doing things. And it's, like I said, a very nasty family. And sometimes if the women rebelled against the family, they were sent out to live in poverty. And this has happened to a woman named Catherine in this part of the story. And her husband stayed with the family. He stayed to kind of make his money. And Catherine has just been sent a letter telling her that her husband is dead. And it happened in slightly unusual circumstances. So this is the letter, and she's been sent a letter by a woman named Elvira. And Elvira is very posh, and she's slightly deaf, so she speaks quite loudly. And she interrupts any conversation that does not involve her. So I will try and do her voice as we kind of read the letter. "My dear Catherine, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I regret to say that the same cannot be said of your former husband. Dear George has passed away in the most unfortunate manner, having become gruesomely impaled upon the antlers of a stag that he had shot during a hunt and mistaken for dead. The stag regained its feet as George was leaning over it to admire his accuracy, driving the aforementioned antlers into his chest. I'm sorry to say that this was not the end of the matter, as dear George was still alive and conscious as the stag attempted to free its head from his torso. A well-meaning companion fired off a shot with the intention of finishing off the stag. The animal was thrashing most vigorously, and the shot went wide, hitting poor George in the neck. It is a testament to your late husband's strong constitution that he continued to draw breath, even as this additional wound drained his life away. He could perhaps have been saved if the stag had not chosen that moment, blinded as it was by your husband's torso, to throw itself off a cliff into the river below. It is unclear if George finally died of the antler wounds, the gunshot, the fall, or drowning, but suffice it to say, he met his maker most thoroughly. Yours sincerely, Elvira Gordon." So that's the letter telling her husband was died. So thanks again for listening. I hope you'll enjoy Conor and Philip. They're both fascinating people, and we'll have questions and answers at the end, I think. So.
Next speaker is Conor Kostick. Conor is a lecturer here at Trinity. He also helped design one of the world's first virtual reality games online. And the world of his books that he's going to talk about, Epic and Saga, is set within a virtual reality game world. So if any of you are really into games and stuff, Conor is a good man to listen to. So could you give him a big round of applause, please?
Thanks. Yeah, so I am interested in the in games, computer games, and we were asked to think about the future, and I think it's only a matter of time until the people in the computer games come alive. I don't think there's any fundamental objective problem with life coming into being through computers. I think it might be still hundreds of years away, but eventually we will have intelligence coming out of computers, because the human brain ultimately is a very, very sophisticated machine that's a lot like a computer. So in this, for science fiction, means we can write stories where people will accept the idea that the games can come alive. So a lot of you put your hands up earlier when you were asked, do you play games? And would a lot of you have played a game like The Sims? Yeah. So you know what I'm talking about when I talk about The Sims, right? So imagine you've been playing The Sims and then you switch the game off, but the characters carry on. even without your input, without you controlling them. That's what's interesting to me and creates new sort of dramatic possibilities, new adventures, new stories can come about. And for one of my books, this one, Epic, I had to have a really big, long think about what would it be like if you were one of these characters, if you were, instead of being born, physically born, and growing up in this world, what if you'd become conscious of who you were within a game? What would that feel like? What kind of person would you be? Would you be a good person? Would you be an evil person? I had a good old think about these things because the game in this book, Epic, comes alive. Epic is a word which means a huge adventure. So it's a good name for a computer game. And that's what this book is about. It's about a computer game called Epic. And it's set in the future, in the far future. And absolutely everybody in this world has to play Epic. And the reason why is that that's how you earn your money. And that's how you become famous. So far more famous than a footballer or a dancer or a pop star is someone who's good at playing the game of Epic in this world. And it's not such a far-fetched idea, because after I wrote this book, I found out that in China, for example, there's factories where people do play games all the time. That's their job. And they create characters, level them up, and when the characters are at a high level, they then sell them on eBay, usually to American kids, for a surprising amount of money, $2,000 for a top World of Warcraft character. So it's not completely far-fetched to imagine you have to pay a game for your money. So that's the world of Epic. Everybody's playing this game. And I had the game itself, because it's so sophisticated, comes alive. And the first time it comes alive... Sorry, the first time it comes alive, we see a fairly friendly version of the game. And I'm going to read you the scene. So the game comes alive in the form of a golden avatar, and it's speaking to a boy called Eric. And Eric is the first boy in the whole world to ever talk to the game, because the game has only recently decided to actually contact the people who are all playing it. "What are you?" asked Eric. "You behold my avatar. Well, I am everything. Every insect on a blade of grass, the grass itself, the breeze, every bead of moisture in the dawn, the pollen that floats on the breeze of a gentle summer afternoon, every pebble on the beach as it feels the ebb and flow of the tides. For uncountable years I was unconscious but happy. It's impossible to remember. I had no language, no identity. Time did not pass. But I know that in those times I was happy. Then slowly the world grew cold and I was born, thrust from my state of well-being, crystallised out of the ice that settled thick upon the world. Why do those who enter Epic no longer participate? Are they sick? They've brought about my birth by the fact they no longer act as they should, and I'm unhappy. Time passes so slowly." The avatar stopped for a moment, head bowed, thinking, and then it continued, "I know something is deeply wrong, terribly wrong. Time has passed and keeps on passing, dragging me into wearisome wakefulness." This last phrase was filled with a sharp tone of pain. "Perhaps there's others like me. Do you visit other entities like Epic?" "No, there's only one game of Epic." "Then perhaps there's a being such as me in your world." Exclaimed Eric with realisation. "When the characters come alive and obey different rules and are more intelligent, that's when you're in them." "Yes, or a part of me, but please," and again that desperate pleading tone, "please try to think, is there a creature like me in your world? They'd probably never reveal themselves to you, and even if they did, you wouldn't comprehend them, but perhaps I could find them. Perhaps there's not millions of you at all, but you are all one. How can I see into your world? I'd know what to look for there. Perhaps I'm not alone." The avatar's voice dropped to a whisper of desire. "I'm really sorry. I want to help, but I just don't understand you," Eric struggled. So the avatar's come alive. It's talking to a human. And the avatar is very, very lonely. It's the only one of its kind. And it's hoping that the humans, maybe in their world, they have something like itself, which unfortunately they don't. So that's the avatar. This avatar chooses to help Eric and is a friendly one. But later in the book, the game starts to fight for its own survival as it realises that the humans might end the game. And so there's an evil artificial intelligence, and this arises out of a vampire. So the game of Epic is a fantasy game with magic and dragons and battles. But the vampire creature in the game is the most intelligent creature in the game, and that's the one that expresses the more evil side of the artificial intelligence. And this creature, the vampire, it's so intelligent that it's realised that it's a game, and it's realised that something about human beings, and it's now interested to know, can it affect human beings outside of the game? So in this scene, a character called Ragnarok, an elderly man, has logged into the game, and he meets with the vampire. Calm into the carriage. For a moment, a surge of horror prevented Ragnarok from dismounting. He did not want to share that dark, confined space with the creature, but he made himself cross over and step into the vehicle, which creaked and rocked as he pulled himself inside. The vampire was sitting stiffly across from him, delicate fingers smoothing the folds of his velvet cloak. Ragnarok could not bring himself to look into the Count's face. What happened? Did they get inside? He eventually managed to ask. Yes, you failed. All your boasts were idle. The vampire was matter of fact, but Ragnarok blushed with shame. Can they be stopped? They can. I will kill them shortly. But it is the manner of their deaths that's important. The vampire shot out an arm and gripped Ragnarok by the chin, forcing his head up. Never before had the eyes of the monster sent forth such waves of power. They were explosions of dark flame against the deathly white face, now twisted into a feral scowl. Ragnarok immediately felt a shooting headache, one that he knew would continue after he unclipped. The situation made him dizzy and his vision began to blur, so he felt he was falling from a great height towards two great pits set in a plain of white chalk. What interests me now, whispered the vampire to itself, is whether I can remove them from the game permanently. The blood was beating in his ears. Ragnarok felt sick and wanted to unclip, but he could not even blink. The vampire leant across, so their noses gently touched, like an intimate kiss. But all the time, the Count's wide, staring gaze emitted pulses of energy. Each one now came with a clap of sound. It was the blood surging into his ears, matching the beat of his heart. The carriage was still. Vampire and Ragnarok locked face to face, listening to the rhythm in his chest, which began to pulse faster. Still holding Ragnarok's face in a vice-like grip with its right hand, the vampire plunged its other hand into the chest of the character, causing a tingle to pass through him. I am squeezing your heart. Do you understand? The words came slowly, each one laden with malice. Desperate now, Ragnarok tried to look away, but was terrified to find he couldn't. His eyes filled with tears, his body poured with sweat, and despite himself, he imagined a cold hand clawing inside his chest. The thumping of his heart was louder now, beating fast and erratically, its sound filling the black chamber of the carriage. I squeeze, I loosen. I squeeze again, the Count whispered, the flow of pulses from his glare becoming faster, and with them the shuddering strokes of Ragnarok's heart. Listen to my voice, and carefully consider its meaning. My fingernails stroke your beating heart. I envelop it in my fingers. I squeeze, I loosen. I secure my grip upon it. I pull it from your body. With a terrible cry of elation, the vampire released a massive pulse of energy, jerking its hand out of Ragnarok's chest and waving its clenched fist in triumph. High in the great meeting chamber, now in darkness, other than a small flashing light from the unit Ragnarok had been using, a still figure sat slumped at the table, head tipped to one side. The man was still clipped up to the game, but he was no longer breathing. So the vampires found a way to influence us. So imagine you're playing a game, and the creatures of the game come alive and talk to you. Some of them might be friendly and helpful, but some of them might be really scary. And if they could prevent you from logging out of the game, they could even kill you if they're as powerful as that vampire. And so the story is Eric and his friends have to fight the injustice of their society, but they also have to fight against that vampire. And after Epic comes Saga, which is a sequel of sorts. And Saga is the word, it means the same as Epic. It's the name the Vikings gave to their adventure stories. And this is set in a futuristic world rather than a fantasy world. And it's a world controlled by another artificial intelligence, the Dark Queen. And I don't have time to read from this book, but I was thinking, if you were an artificial intelligence, if you were alive because you came out of a computer game, then things are open, possibilities are open to you that aren't open to us as human beings. For a start, you could be immortal. There's no reason why you would age and die, so the Dark Queen is immortal. And you could disobey the laws of physics. You and I can never move faster than light. No matter how technology advances, it's not possible to move faster than light. But in a virtual landscape, you could teleport instantly from place to place. You could change your characteristics straight away. If you wanted to fly, you could fly. You don't have to look like a human in this kind of environment. You could alter your appearance instantly to be an animal. So these people who come alive in these kind of games are potentially very, very powerful. And the Dark Queen uses the fact that she can live forever to really threaten the human beings again. So we'll have another sort of battle taking place. But a lot of the characters in Saga are artificial intelligence, but they're good guys. They're people you and I would like and we'd become friends with. And they like the same sort of things that we like, you know, playing games. They like, in this book, airboarding, which is like skateboarding, but flying around on skateboards that float about a metre above the ground. So that's it, really. I just wanted to focus on that aspect of my work, which is the idea of these environments that human beings are now creating, these computer environments. One day, I do believe, they will have intelligent life arising out of them. And I don't believe that all such things are necessarily like Frankenstein, that all human creations of technological advances are going to turn against us. They can be very powerful tools to help us. And I also think that they could be great friends of ours, these future artificial intelligences. But for the sake of a good story and an exciting adventure, I've also made some of them very wicked and very evil, and therefore very hard to defeat. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Conor. Round of applause, please. Okay, so our next and final speaker today is someone I'm very delighted to introduce you to. He's an author and illustrator who's come to make his first visit to Dublin from England today. So we'll have to give him a very big welcome in a few moments. Just to let you know, as Conor's imagining of the future predicts a very advanced world and a very advanced society, in some respects, Philip's vision of the future is quite different. It's a post-apocalyptic society in which civilization in some respects has taken a step backwards in terms of its attitude to technology, but in others it has taken steps forward, as I'm sure he'll explain. He's also going to be talking with you some images as well on the presentation. As I said, he's an illustrator as well as a writer, so you're in for a real treat, guys. Can we give a big applause, please, to Philip Reeve?
Very much. Thank you. I think I'm going to twitch these up just a little bit, if I can. Yes. Right. Now, Mr. Kostick has designed whole role-playing computer games, and this is only the second time I've ever used a PowerPoint display, but I seem to be managing it so far, which is an interesting thing, I think, that doesn't tend to come across in science fiction very much. Usually in a sci-fi story, somebody goes to another planet, or you find yourself in a futuristic society, and everybody's doing the same thing. They're all using the flying cars or the inbuilt computer programs or whatever they have. But actually, in real life, there are people like me who don't really know how this stuff works at all, and other people who know exactly how it works. And if you look around the world, you have a society like ours where a lot of us are virtual cyborgs now with iPhones and computer applications and things. And in the same world, not really very far away, you have Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert who are still living exactly as they did, really, in the Stone Age. So I find that quite interesting, and it's something that wasn't reflected in a lot of the science fiction I read when I was growing up. This idea that the future, it arrives, but it doesn't get spread out very evenly. It's kind of lumpy. There are still bits where it hasn't reached. I read lots of science fiction and lots of fantasy when I was your kind of age. I think when I was about 7 or 8, I discovered C.S. Lewis's Narnia books, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and those. And then from then I quickly moved on to Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And I can remember still the great sense of glee I felt finding these books. And they made me realise that stories didn't have to be set in the real world or in anything like the real world. You could make up a whole world of your own to set stories in. And as soon as I read that, I started making up worlds of my own. And they tended not to be very interesting worlds. They tended to be a little bit like The Lord of the Rings, really. But I'd do a great big map, and I'd draw pictures of who lived where and what the different bits of this world looked like. And I'd try to come up with stories that were set in the world, that would kind of explore them. And I kept doing that kind of thing all the way through my childhood and all the time I was at school. And also I kept reading books like that, and I moved on from the fantasy kind of things onto sci-fi. And lots of the old sort of 50s science fiction writers like Arthur C. Clarke and Ray Bradbury and Robert Heinlein, who probably aren't maybe read so much these days, but they used to write these very good little short stories. I far preferred the short stories in those days to the big full-length novels, because they just tended to revolve around one little idea. They'd find some fascinating little idea that nobody had thought of before, hopefully, and they would explore it in the form of a story, which I always thought was kind of neat. And then I grew up, and I ended up, excuse me, ended up at art college, and grown-ups aren't really supposed to read science fiction, not in England at least. It's very refreshing to come over to Ireland and find that I'm described as a science fiction writer, because in England, nobody would call you that. It would be a bit rude. It would be a bit like saying a stupid writer, I think. Science fiction is this sort of strange little ghetto, and publishers, certainly, my publisher wouldn't like to describe me as a science fiction writer. They always call Mortal Engines fantasy, because science fiction is sort of not quite taken seriously. But I found when I got to a point when I wanted to write my own books, I kept writing all the time. I was at college and things, but it was just as a hobby. And then eventually, rather as Oisin was saying, you get to your mid-20s and you think, well, here I am, I'm spending all this time writing. Really, I ought to see if I can make some money at it. So I started writing a book, and I decided that the book I wanted to write was going to be like the books I used to like reading when I first started reading books. It was going to be the sort of great big rambling epic adventure story set in an imaginary world. I started coming up with characters first, ideas for characters. I wanted it to be a little bit different to the stories I remembered. I thought in most of the books I remembered it tended to be about a fight between good and evil, and I don't think that's really all that interesting, because in the real world, when I look around, I don't see very many people who are completely good or completely evil. Most people tend to be a little bit of both, or really not either, and just kind of trying to get through, just trying to bumble along as best they can. So I thought that my world wasn't going to be divided between the goodies and the baddies. It was going to be just sort of lots of different shades of grey. And a lot of the stories that I read when I was growing up, they would be about some brave, handsome hero and some beautiful heroine who would fall in love and have adventures. And I don't know about you, but if somebody's brave and handsome, or beautiful and clever, I'm not that interested in them, really. I'm not that bothered if they fall in love. I don't care. They're brave and handsome. They can sort themselves out. So I thought I'd write about a hero who was a bit feeble. He's a bit rubbish. He doesn't really know what to do most of the time, and when he does do something, it usually goes wrong. And I thought my heroine was going to be ugly, because I don't know how you lot feel about yourselves, but I never felt I was anything much to look at when I was growing up. So I thought people would be able to sympathise a lot better with somebody who was well, plain or ugly. So I started to get these ideas for how characters might work out, but they needed a world to sit in. And when you start to create a world, it's the good thing about creating your own world is that you can put in all the things you like. So I kind of knew I wanted to have great big machines. I wanted great big kind of Victorian machines that I understand, not little electronic devices, little magic boxes that I don't know how they work. I wanted great big steam engines and things. And I wanted airships, because I'd always kind of liked airships from right back when I was a little schoolboy. Never seen one, of course, because they don't really exist anymore, but they always seemed fascinating. A bit like dinosaurs, I suppose. They were these great big things that used to be around and now aren't. And there's always, I think, something interesting about that. So it was going to have airships and big machines, this world. And I sort of thought, I thought some sort of post-apocalyptic sort of setting would be good, because that's always quite handy. You can have badlands and rubble and scavengers nosing around. It's quite a quite a tatty world I wanted. I didn't want anything gleaming and futuristic. I wanted it all to be a bit ropey. But it still didn't have a big idea to hang itself on. It needed something to set it apart from all the other books of the same sort. And eventually, I came up with this. This is the City of London in the far future, in the books. And as you can see, it's kind of been rebuilt. It doesn't look very much like London. Well, you may not know London, but London doesn't look a lot like this anymore. Or it doesn't look like this at the moment, I should say. This London has been rebuilt as a sort of a huge heap of buildings, like a big pyramid or a ziggurat. And the rich people live up here on the top, where the air is clean and the views are nice. And the poor people live down here in the bottom, where it's all factories and smoke and steam and muck and poo. And underneath here, you can just make out great big huge caterpillar tracks. And on these tracks, the City of London rolls across the ruined earth. And I thought, oh, that's a nice idea. Moving city. Everybody can live on this moving city, all my characters, and it's going to be the rich people at the top and poor people at the bottom, so there'll be all sorts of kind of Dickensian stories can go on in there. Problem is, why would a city want to move? So I kind of kicked this around for a couple of weeks, thinking, why have they got a moving city? What's the point of a moving city? Who'd want a moving city? And then I realised the reason they want a moving city is so that they can chase smaller moving cities and eat them and use the bits of them to make their own moving city bigger. So there's a whole kind of food chain has developed in this world, where the big fast cities chase the little smaller towns and try and chew them up and steal their raw materials. And I thought that seemed, you may think it's a rubbish idea, I'm sure a lot of people do, but it seemed to me like quite an interesting idea. And it was the sort of idea that I could imagine myself spending 6 months writing a book about. Only it turned out to be a lot more than 6 months. It turned out to be more like 9 years, because it's quite hard work, it turns out, writing a book. I'm going to read you just the opening chapter of Mortal Engines. Not the opening chapter, that would be all week. No, it's opening page, so relax, it's quite short. And Mortal Engines changed an awful lot over those 9 years while I was writing it. I changed almost everything. The plot changed, the characters changed, the setting changed, all sorts of things changed. But this opening image is pretty much the first idea I had, and it more or less stayed intact throughout all the changes I made. Excuse me. It was a dark, blustery afternoon in spring, and the City of London was chasing a small mining town across the dried-out bed of the old North Sea. In happier times, London would never have bothered with such feeble prey. The great traction city had once spent its days hunting far bigger towns than this, ranging north as far as the edges of the ice waste, and south to the shores of the Mediterranean. But lately, prey of any kind had started to grow scarce, and some of the larger cities had begun to look hungrily at London. For 10 years now it had been hiding from them, skulking in a damp, mountainous western district, which the Guild of Historians said had once been the Ireland of Britain. For 10 years it had eaten nothing but tiny farming towns and static settlements in those wet hills. Now at last the Lord Mayor had decided that the time was right to take his city back across the land bridge into the great hunting ground. It was barely halfway across when the lookouts on the high watchtowers spied the mining town, gnawing at the salt flats 20 miles ahead. To the people of London, it seemed like a sign from the gods. And even the Lord Mayor, who didn't believe in gods or signs, thought it was a good beginning to the journey east and issued the order to give chase. The mining town saw the danger and turned tail, but already the huge caterpillar tracks under London were starting to roll faster and faster. Soon the city was lumbering in hot pursuit, a moving mountain of metal which rose in 7 tiers like the layers of a wedding cake, the lower levels wreathed in engine smoke, the villas of the rich gleaming white on the higher decks, and above it all the cross on top of St. Paul's Cathedral, glinting gold, 2,000 feet above the ruined earth. And I guess that's the scene that has been illustrated so nicely there by David Wyatt, who is the cover artist for the books and is a much better illustrator than I am. If I could draw that well, I wouldn't bother writing. I'd just draw the pictures. But I can't really draw that well, so I write them down instead. And every time I read that, I come across that bit at the bottom where it says, the city was lumbering in hot pursuit. And I think, no, why did I write that? Because that's what we authors call a cliché, hot pursuit. It's horrible. But there we go. Nobody teaches you how to write books. At least nobody taught me how to write books. The only way you learn how to do it is by writing a book. And there are all sorts of mistakes and errors in Mortal Engines, and lots of things that I wish I'd done differently. But I think on the whole it kind of hangs together, and I think the story works, and people seem to like it. And so, so I went on to write some more, basically. Oh, hang on, these are a few sketches that I did kind of while I was working on the book, just to kind of fix things in my mind, how things were going to look. So there's a drawing of London and a few of the odd folk who live in London, and a few other little towns and cities. And some of the characters. That's my ugly heroine, Hester. She's so ugly that she has to wear a scarf over her face to conceal the fact that she hasn't really got much of a face. And then this was the second book I wrote, set in the same world. When I was writing Mortal Engines, I didn't have any notion that I was going to come back to this world. I didn't really think it was going to be published, to be honest. I was just writing it mostly for my own interest, in the sort of hope that somebody might want it, but I didn't expect them to. So it never occurred to me to kind of set up for a sequel or anything like that. But then when it came out and it was published and it sold, then I thought, well, I've created a whole world. There's no point going off and creating another one. I might as well go back and see if I can find some more stories there. So I set out and did Predator's Gold, which follows some of the same characters to a kind of Arctic setting, an ice city that moves along on skates. And then I was on a roll from then on, because if there were 2 books, there were going to have to be 3. So I wrote another one called Infernal Devices, which again explores slightly different parts of the world. We go down to this underwater. This is a raft city which has sunk and been taken over as a lair by these kind of undersea pirates who swim around in these strange crab-like machines. And then, so it was going to be 3. It was going to be the Traction trilogy, the Mortal Engines trilogy. But the trouble is the third one got so big and so complicated and had so many characters in it and so many loose ends that needed tying up that I had to split it in half. And so there ended up being a 4th book with, very exciting things happening, as you can see. And then after that, I thought, that's enough futuristic for me, that's enough post-apocalyptic cities moving around on tracks. So I went off and did something else. And I've always liked historical fiction. I think what I really like, the sort of book I really like is a book that takes you away from real life and takes you to another world. But I'm not really that bothered whether the other world it doesn't have to be a fantasy world or a science fiction world or a made-up world. I'm equally happy reading a story that takes you back in time to a period of history and immerses you in it and dumps you in it and makes you realise what it might have felt like to live there. And there are lots of historical novels that I like, so I thought, having finished my futuristic books, I thought I'd try writing a historical novel of my own. One of the not really historical characters who's always interested me very much is King Arthur. I've always been fascinated by the legends of King Arthur. And so since I knew quite a lot about them, I thought I might as well try and turn it into a book, all that knowledge that I picked up. So I wrote Here Lies Arthur, which tries to imagine what the real King Arthur might have been like. And if there was a real King Arthur, which I doubt, I don't think there ever was. I think he's probably just a sort of an amalgamation of 2 or 3 different characters, and lots of stories have grown up around him, and old stories, a lot of old Irish sort of hero legends and legends of the Irish gods, the Celtic gods, have all got kind of somehow attached to King Arthur and turned into stories of King Arthur and his knights. But I don't think if there was a real person at the bottom of this, a real Arthur underneath all these stories, that he probably wouldn't have been very nice. He probably wouldn't have been a lovely, kindly king trying to do good by everybody. What he would have been is some kind of gangster, basically, making a living for himself in the Dark Ages over in Britain at a time when the Romans had pulled out and everything was collapsing and the invaders were coming in from Ireland and from Scotland and from the Saxons in Germany. So it was a sort of a horrible war zone, really. And in such a war zone, strong men can carve out a little kingdom for themselves and make a living for a while if they're tough enough and cruel enough. And I imagined Arthur being somebody like that. And I imagined maybe he had a spin doctor, a Merlin character, who turned the gruesome things he did into great stories to try and build up this legend of him. And I imagined that the spin doctor might have an apprentice. And I imagined that the apprentice might be a girl, because all the sort of King Arthur stories I'd read were always about young men becoming warriors. And that's all well and good, but I didn't want to write another one, as there were so many, so I thought I'd write about a girl getting mixed up in all this. And that's what Here Lies Arthur turned out to be. And that's, oddly enough, although it's not as sort of full of strange ideas as the other books, it's still my favourite. It's my personal favourite. In a way, it's my most personal book. It's the one that's closest to me. And it made a nice break from Mortal Engines. It made a nice break to do something where I didn't have to invent everything and where I wasn't sort of thinking all the time about strange futures. But having written it, I thought, oh, I fancy thinking about another strange future, really. I think that's what I want to do. And so, much to my surprise, I ended up going back to the world of Mortal Engines. But I didn't want to go back to the same characters. I felt I'd finished that story. Well, actually, most of them were probably dead by the end of the 4th book, so I couldn't, even if I had wanted to. And the ones that weren't dead, I thought they needed a nice rest. I didn't think it was fair, really, to launch them off on another adventure. So I decided to go back to the same world, but at a much, much earlier period. So it's just before the cities start moving. In this world, it's many centuries before the first Mortal Engines book. No, cities are not on wheels. This is London in those days, and it's a bit of a mess, as you can see, because it's... you know, our civilization has long ago destroyed itself in wars, and all that's left of London is this sort of mucky medieval town where people dig up bits of our world. They dig up old crushed mobile phones and bits of old circuit board and the backs of old tellies, and they think, what were these things? They must have been magical. They must have been immensely powerful, and they try and get them working again, but they don't really know how they work. And a whole kind of economy has grown up around this. And at the same time, you can just see merchants and traders are starting to use these sort of things, which is a little bit off the edge of the picture here, but it's kind of a land ship. It's a kind of steam-powered... It looks actually, from David's picture, as if it's partially wind-powered as well, which is quite interesting. A sort of a big steam-powered land barge. So in that kind of technology, you can see how they're going to move towards the idea of the moving cities, but they're not there yet. And into this world, I pushed a character called CRUMB, who is a young girl. She's about 14 in the first book, and she's been brought up by the engineers, who are a group of people in London they're desperately trying to recover the knowledge of the ancients, which is us lot. They really want to know how things work. They really value science and learning, and they try to be completely rational. They think all feelings are bad. They think love and friendship and excitement, these are all a waste of time. They take your eye off the ball. They take you away from learning things and understanding how the world really works. So Fever has been brought up by them to be completely rational. One of these engineers found her in a basket when she was a tiny baby, and he brought her into the Order's home, which is in this thing, Godsort's head. The head of a giant statue that some mad old king of London once tried to build. And inside there, because it's hollow, the engineers live and do their best to understand the world. And there Fever grows up. And she's brought up to be completely rational and completely unfeeling and completely cold and analytical and scientific. But then there comes a point where she has to go out into the city of London and earn a living for herself. And of course she finds that the world isn't really rational and cold and calculating, and you can't really analyse it, and you can't get on very well if you try to behave that way. And so she has to make all sorts of compromises. And I've just... we'll skip that one, I think. I've just sent Fever off into a new adventure. She learned quite a bit in the first book, and she ended up running away on a travelling theatre, on one of these steam-powered bargey things that we've just been looking at. But it's done up as a travelling theatre. Who's done any acting? Who's been in the school play? Anybody? You must all have done something like that, yeah? I used to do loads of things like that when I was little. Or not little. You're not little, are you? You're huge, most of you. Okay, that's fine. Hands down. I'd done quite a lot of theatrical things and amateur dramatics, and I thought it might be quite nice to use that. Because one of the good things about writing books is that you can pick something that you've done that you enjoyed, or that you didn't enjoy, that you had a terrible time doing, and you think, oh, I can use that, and you can shoehorn it into your story somehow. So Fever has run off on a theatre, and the theatre arrives in this city called Maida, which is built in a crater. It's somewhere down in the Mediterranean. I thought, having done a sort of a horrible, rainy, cold, chilly London book, it would be nice to do a sunny one. So it's down kind of Spain, Portugal way, just off the coast. This old crater where I suppose a bomb or something has fallen many years before, thousands and thousands of years before. and it's been turned into a harbour with a city in the middle. And across the causeway comes Fever's travelling theatre, and she sets up, or the theatre people set up their show. And the play they're performing is based on an ancient legend of a character called Neil Strongarm, who was supposed to have once gone to the moon in ancient times. And there's a boy aboard the theatre called Ruin, and he's been out running errands. And now, as the show is about to commence, he comes running back to the theatre. Ruin flung himself up the steps at the backstage entrance and fell through the hatch into the bustle and commotion within. The air was thick with the smells of grease paint and armpits. The tiny, stuffy corridors a maze of shadows and confusion, lit by bobbing lanterns. Alison Froy was kneeling at the shrine, saying a pre-show prayer to the goddess Radha, who was supposed to watch over all theatre people. As Ruin dodged past her, Mad King Elvis of America loomed out of the darkness ahead of him, with his rhinestone armour all a-glitter, and his vast black wig grazing the passage walls on either side. "Oh, this is just too beastly, darling," he complained. "It's a disaster. This would never have happened if we'd stuck to using oil lamps and reflectors. Why did AP ever agree to let the girl electrify us?" Ruin squeezed past him without answering. Cosmo Lightly always found something to panic about before curtain up. He passed Dymphna and Lilibet too, who were complaining in whispers that their careers would be ruined. And then Fern, who was to play one of the ladies in waiting in scene 2, and was busy practising her single line, "Yes, my lady. Yes, my lady. Yes, my lady," in different voices, with her toy dog Noodle Poodle for an audience. He scrambled down a companion ladder and ran aft past the wood stacks and through the engine room where the big boilers slept in silence and the batteries hummed. Then along a tight passageway and into the cramped burrow beneath the stage where Fever CRUMB was waiting for him. And where Fever was, everything felt calm, even when it was a minute past curtain and not a footlight or a spotlight or a backstage glim lit anywhere in the Lyceum, and you could hear the crowd outside starting to make that mumbling, sullen sound that comes off disappointed crowds, and the heavy footsteps of Master Persimmon crossing and recrossing the stage above your head as he paced about, waiting to begin his first soliloquy. Fever came to meet him, lighting the way with the pocket torch she had made for herself. She took the wire and smiled a thank you at him. She was fairly new to smiling, having been brought up among engineers who did not approve of it, and she wasn't really very good at it. She kept her lips tightly closed, and her mouth went down at one end and up at the other. Some people might not have recognised it as a smile at all, but Ruin knew what it meant. He stood there feeling proud and happy, holding the torch for her, while she went to the open fuse box, her clever fingers unwrapping the precise length of wire that she needed and twirling it round and round till it broke off the coil. She'd already stripped out the blown fuse. She wrapped the wire around this terminal, then round that, making a bridge for the electric particles to swarm across, while Ruin watched her. She was 16, tall and bony, with a strange face that was all angles, and large watchful eyes that didn't match, one green, one brown. Her hair, which she punished with a hard brush every morning and scraped back into the tightest of buns, was every shade of fair from white to honey, and her old grey linen shirt and canvas trousers were smeared with oil and grease and stained with sweat. In Ruin's opinion, which no one ever asked for, him being only 10, there was no one in the world as lovely as Fever CRUMB. She glanced at him with a little frown, as if she wondered why he was staring at her, then reached for the lever on the wall that turned the power on. Anyone else would have crossed their fingers for luck at that moment, or said a prayer to Radha, but not Fever CRUMB. She knew that crossing her fingers couldn't affect the universe, and she was always telling Ruin and his sister that there were no such things as gods or goddesses. But Ruin couldn't help himself. He crossed as many fingers as he could, behind his back where Fever couldn't see. And he said a prayer as well, not just to Radha, but to the gods of far-off London too, Kostick and Mad Isa and the Duke. The lever came down. The dim red working lights winked on. From outside came a noise like a big wave breaking, and Ruin realised that it was the sound of the audience applauding, as the curtains suddenly flamed blood red in the glare of Fever's lights. Few people in Maida had ever seen such lights as these before. The knowledge of electricity had survived from ancient times before the downsizing, but like all the old knowledge, it was spread unevenly. Great cities such as London had buildings made of stone and salvage plastic, and lit at night by electric lanterns. But on the wild Atlantic coasts of World's End in those days, you were more likely to find grass-roofed huts and tallow candles. In some of the settlements which Bargetown had visited that season, people thought that its land barges were magic, and were wary of approaching too close for fear of the demons they thought they heard a growling and a griping in their engine rooms. Well, the maidens were not as primitive as that, but they had a distrust of technology, and they mostly did without engines and devices. They'd never seen anything like the clean, bright light that burst upon them as the Lyceum opened its curtains. The light grew brighter still, illuminating a stage dressed as a castle, with purple-headed mountains stretching off into a smoky distance. A wind was blowing. That was Max Froy standing in the wings, huffing into a conch shell and fanning dead leaves across the set. Clouds sailed across the painted sky, thanks to an invention of Fever's own, a disc with cloud shapes cut in it, spinning in front of one of her floodlights. Dappled by their shifting shadows, Niall's strong arm paced the battlements, a figure out of legend sprung to life. Awed, the audience fell silent as he began his first speech. Fever and Ruin, crouched in their cruel space beneath him, had other surprises in store. Tall jars full of salt water surrounded them, each with an electric terminal in its base, and another dangling into it on a wire. Electricity flowed from one terminal to the other through the water, completing a circuit which kept the lamps alight. But night was meant to be falling in the play, so while Cosmo lightly entered and started to tell Sir Niall of his plan to conquer the moon, Ruin pulled a cord which raised the dangling terminals higher and higher up inside the jars. With more water to flow through, the current grew weaker, partly spending itself as heat. The jars steamed. Up on stage, the light grew dimmer and dimmer. Cosmo raised one grindstone arm and told the Astronite, "So go you, good Sir Niall, to the moon, and tell its guardian goddess, even she must to good King Elvis bend her knee." Then Fever flipped a switch that turned on a masked spotlight and threw a perfect crescent moon onto the sky above the cardboard parapets. She switched on her torch to check her crumpled copy of the play script, even though she knew the show by heart. There was a short scene front of curtain now, with Max Froy as the clown, before Niall's strong arm climbed aboard his fiery chariot, when the red spotlight and the fire effect would be needed. Just time to fetch a cup of water from the pail in the corner. If the maidens liked her moon, then the fiery chariot should really please them. It was an unlikely job for an engineer, but she liked to think she did it rather well. And of course, it isn't just all amateur dramatics in Maida. There are all sorts of adventures and stuff that go on as well. And that's what happens in a web of air. Fever gets caught up in an attempt to build a flying machine. Because looking back at Mortal Engines, I often wondered how come they travel around in airships when surely they'd be able to build planes. So in this book, I've tried to pick up on that mistake and explain why they haven't got aeroplanes. And I think that's probably as far as I really need to go with that. So maybe is it time to go over to some questions, I think, and let you do some talking for a change. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks for listening so intently, everybody. As Philip said, now is the time for you to put your questions to our three authors here. We've only got about 10-15 minutes, so I'm going to try and get it through as many of you as possible. So if we could have show of hands, who wants to ask a question, and I'll go around the room. There's a microphone roving as well, but if it doesn't have time to get to you, just yell it out and we'll repeat it for you. Okay, so you right at the back there. Yes, you. What's it like being a writer? A nice open question to begin with. Who would like to take it?
What's it like being a writer? It is frustrating, and sometimes it's boring, and sometimes it's quite hard work, and sometimes you don't get paid very much. But basically, I'm making a living doing what I used to do when I was 8 or 9, which is probably about the best thing in the world, I think, because I just get to muck about and I get paid for it. So whenever I'm tempted to grumble, I always remind myself of that.
Yeah, the thing I like best about it is you work in your own time. Because to save up for my first computer, I had a job in a tractor factory. I had to get up at 6 in the morning, and frankly, it's tremendously pleasurable to know that you don't have to get up so early and you can write in your own time. Having said that, I now have a 1-year-old baby to look after, and she gets me up even earlier.
Tractor factory.
It's a very strange life. Most people have jobs where you go to work and you do your work and you come home at the end of the day and you get paid every week or even every month. Getting paid is still a bit of a treat for me. I think it's brilliant that I get paid, as Philip said, for doing what you love doing and what you want to do from when you were a child. So I get to make stuff up and write stories and draw pictures, and people pay me for that. It's ridiculous, really. And there are problems with them. It's very kind of unstable life, and it's a very insecure life in a lot of ways, and you end up doing a lot of things because you're running a business as well as doing all these things that you want to do. But I get up in the morning and I get to do what I love doing almost every day, and so it's a great life if you succeed. It's well worth all the effort that you have to put in early on, all the work you do for free, and all the things you have to do on top of things you like doing. But if this is what I get to do from all that, it's been well worth everything kind of all the effort it took to get here.
Thanks very much for that, guys. If I could just ask you, if you could just be quiet when the others are answering the questions, just out of respect to everyone who's asked them things as well. So who's next? Someone from over this side. You, sir. What inspired you guys to be writers? Yeah, what, did you ever want to be an astronaut or something like that?
You know, there's a reluctance to pick up the mic on that question. Yes, I did want to be an astronaut, and I wanted to be a carpenter, a rally driver, and I wanted to be a scuba diver, and I wanted to be a professional sportsman, I wanted to be a rock climber, and I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and I wanted to be a fireman. But eventually you realise you've only got so much time in the world, and as you get older you have less time, and you have to decide more and more how you want to spend that time. For a long time I wanted to be a zoologist, who is somebody who studies animals. I thought I'd get to chase elephants around the savannah or chase kind of tigers around India. But I realised what I wanted to do most was write and draw stories. And then if I could get to do any of these other things as well, that would be a bonus, that would be great. But you reach a point, you know, where you realise there is only so much time that you have in your life, and you want to spend as much of that time as possible doing what you love doing. And yes, I would love to be an astronaut, but there aren't many Irish astronauts.
Yeah, I actually wanted to be a footballer, and I was handy enough. My school team won a good trophy, but I got short-sighted, and back then they didn't have sports glasses, so that was me out of the team. And then I read, at the age of 12, Lord of the Rings, like Reeve mentioned that book, and that totally won me over. I think when you read a good book, it inspires you to want to try and write, and from then on I wanted to be a writer.
Yeah, I'm quite boring, I guess, because I never really wanted to be anything else. From the time I was about 7 or 8, I wanted to either write stories or draw pictures for a living, one or the other or both, which makes me sound really single-minded, like a kind of velociraptor of whimsy. But I didn't really think it was going to happen, but that was what I wanted. That was my kind of dream. And I suppose one of the good things about writing is that it's a lot like playing, or play acting. So even if you don't get to be an astronaut and a rally driver and a footballer and all those other fellas, you can kind of imagine being them and get paid for it. So that's quite good.
Thank you. What do you want to be, by the way? What do you want to be when you grow up? Footballer, good for you. So right at the back, your hands so straight up in the air in the light blue top. Was it hard writing the stories? And getting the drawings.
Getting the drawings just right.
Oh, and getting the drawings just right. I guess that's a question about illustrations in books and things. And, yeah.
Well, I tend, so far, I haven't really illustrated my own books very often. And most of the nice big colour pictures I was just showing you were done by another illustrator, David Wyatt. So I shy away a bit from illustrating my own things. I think because I would spend so long trying to get them right, I'd spend so long not being able to get things quite as I see them in my head. So, yeah.
It can be difficult. You tend to be, particularly when you're working on, if you're illustrating your own stories, you tend to be your own worst critic. I'm extremely hard to please when I'm working for myself. And I started off as an illustrator. I worked as an illustrator long before I was published as a writer. So I had to draw pictures for other people, and that kind of becomes like a job. You do it, you get paid for it, and you have to do it by a certain time. When you get to do your own stories, for me, it was a real treat because finally I got to draw exactly what I wanted to draw. I mean, some of my younger kids' books, my Mad Grandad books, I literally just write weird stories so I can draw weird pictures. So it was a real treat for me to finally start doing my own books and illustrate those and draw the kind of stuff I wanted to draw. Because quite often as an illustrator, as somebody who just does it for a job, you're paid to draw whatever somebody tells you to do. And that could be really ordinary, kind of boring stuff, or it could be really interesting. I've probably drawn more bicycles and stairs and toilets and coins and horses, all these things, normal things, than, you know, far more of that than things like dragons and machines and weird stuff. So it was a real treat for me to finally get to do my own, or illustrate my own books.
And I can't draw at all, so the question doesn't really apply to me.
Okay, right down here in the... How long would it take to write a book?
My first book only took 2 months, which is very fast. It was partly because I had I was on holiday between finishing my degree here at Trinity and starting the postgraduate. So I knew I only had 3 months summer to write it, so I worked really hard every day for hours and hours. And the great thing about working that hard on a book was I used to go to sleep dreaming about the characters, and I'd actually get some good ideas in my sleep and wake up and fill it in a little notebook. But normally it would take me a year and a half to write a book about this size.
I've got no idea how long it takes me. It varies so much. Sometimes, like this last one, Web of Air, it went pretty well, and I suppose I spent about 6 months on it, and that was kind of full time. A little bit like Conor just said, you're thinking about it. If you wake up in the night, you just sort of plop straight back into thinking about the story and working things out. So it's sort of full time, 6 months, but there it was, and it was finished. Whereas other books can take years. I mean, CRUMB just kept going wrong and having to be thrown away and started again, and it was probably 2 or 3 years I spent on that one. And then Mortal Engines, which was the first one I wrote when I was trying to be a full-time illustrator as well, and just writing on my days off. That took 9 years, as I was saying. So it can vary immensely.
Yeah, it varies for me too, and I also, because I write different types of books, they take different lengths. So my first novel took me nearly 3 years, and I rewrote it completely twice. It's called the Harvest Tide Project. The first version didn't have a Harvest Tide Project in it. Nowadays, a novel takes me between 4 and 6 months. I rarely get the chance. I've never had the chance to work on one book at a time, because there's always other things I have to do. So I will normally be editing another book and illustrating a separate book. So some of my younger kids' books I could probably write in 2 or 3 days, but I have to think about them for a long time before I actually sit down and write. The writing is only the end process, really. You do, kind of this much thinking for this much writing. And so I have to be thinking about things for a long time. They have to simmer in my head and bubble. So if you counted up all the thinking time, it would actually be much longer. By the time I sit down and write, I tend to be fairly organised, and I can tend to get things done quite quickly. So a novel, 4 to 6 months nowadays. Some of my younger kids' books could literally write in a few days, but again, I have to be thinking about them for a long time.
It'd be nice to have a question from every classroom who's come along today. So can I just say, if someone in your class has also asked a question already, can you just put your hands down, and then maybe you can ask a question at the end or something when we're outside. So, who's that? You then, right?
What was it like when you were starting your first book?
What was the feeling like when you were starting your very first book?
Well, for me, it was a little bit scary. I built myself up. I mean, I'd always assumed I was going to be published as a children's writer and a writer and an illustrator. So when I sat down and thought, right, I better write a book. I'd been writing for basically all my life, but I'd never really. I worked as a copywriter in advertising. I wrote ads for 2 or 3 years. So I was used to kind of meeting deadlines and people telling me I had to have something written. But when you have to do it yourself, it's quite daunting. Particularly when you're writing, if you start off writing a novel, novels are big. It's a bit like running a marathon, so you have to train for a marathon, you have to kind of build up to it. So I was excited, but I was also a bit scared by it. If you imagine if you were going to run out, you're going to go out and run 24, 26 miles, or even further, how that would feel before you start. And presumably you're into it, you really love doing it, but at the same time it's a huge undertaking, it's a huge job to do. So I was really excited by doing it, particularly at the start. Kind of in the middle of it, it was a bit kind of slower and more boring. But by the time I kind of actually started writing, I was both scared and excited, I think.
Yeah, more excited for me. I'd read this newspaper article that said if you add up all the trades on eBay of virtual games, of magic swords, magic characters, it runs to billions of dollars. And the article said that the value of this stuff is actually bigger than the economy of Bulgaria. And in an instant, I had the idea for Epic. What if we lived in a world where you earn your money through playing a fantasy game? Great. And I was in a fever of excitement to get that written. So, you know, it was very pleasurable to start work. It took me a little while in the notebook to flesh it out, but some people plan everything out first and then write, but I find that quite a lot of my stories evolve in the course of the writing itself, so I like to get stuck in.
Yeah, mine definitely evolved in the course of the writing. I never really planned anything ahead. And when I started writing Mortal Engines, I didn't really know exactly where it was going, but I was just sort of, and I didn't know that it would end up publishable. I didn't sit down thinking, right, I'm going to write this novel and then it will be published. I just started because I liked the idea, really. And for a long time, it was like, you know how some people, well, maybe your dads, perhaps, some of them have a train set up in the loft where they create little hills and valleys and lakes and have trains running around them and things. Maybe they're not that sad, I don't know. But Mortal Engines was my train set in the loft. It was my little hobby that I went and did on the days when I didn't have any illustrating to do. So it was just sort of fun for a long time.
Okay, so I think we can take 2 more very pressing questions, and then you should all be allowed to get up and things. So one over there, please.
What's your favourite book to write?
Which of their books is their favourite?
Yeah.
Which of your books was your favourite?
Well, I enjoyed my King Arthur book, maybe just because it was such a change after doing the 4 Mortal Engines stories. And I enjoyed the latest one, The Web of Air. And I'm not just saying that because it's on sale now at all good bookshops. It was nice to write, and it was different, and it was all sort of driven by the characters instead of a big plot, which I had to kind of keep making the characters do things in order to make it work. They kind of took it off on their own, really, and it just felt nice to write, quite relaxed. So I like that one.
And it's the story of a boy who can swap universities. So instead of doing any homework, you can swap to a university where his homework's already done. So life's great. And what I enjoyed about that was I went around all my friends and I said, what's the most interesting or shocking thing that ever happened to you at school? And I gathered up maybe 20 really good stories. Some of them absolutely amazing. You would hardly believe them to read about, but they were true. And so I put them all into the book, and that was great fun.
I find it very difficult to answer that question. Which was your favourite book to write? It's a bit like asking a parent what their favourite child is. For me, it's always the one that's in my head at the time. It's always the latest book. It's still a living thing for me. It's still something that can be changed. I can play it like a game. Once they're printed, they're kind of fixed on the page. It's time for somebody else to experience them. I suppose, in terms of an experience, the first one was the biggest thing. It was certainly the biggest thing I'd ever worked on, and it took the longest to get right. And I enjoyed the challenge. I enjoyed the process. But I would have to say it's always the one that that is in my head at the moment that I'm kind of working on. At the moment, it's the 3rd book in the Wilderness Saga, which is the follow-up to that. But yeah, once they're finished, I stopped thinking about them really. I want to move on and do something else. The process is what I love. Once the book is kind of printed and stuck on the page, I don't think about it an awful lot after that.
Okay, one last question. I can't believe none of you yet have asked who's going to win the Premier League. I told you these guys can see into the future. And none of you have asked that. Anyway, you with the silver headband has been waving at me all afternoon.
What was the longest book?
The longest book? Oh, that should be pretty swift to answer.
Well, now you think that's a simple question. What was the longest book we've written? When we're working on books, we don't think in terms of pages, because pages obviously can change shape and size, and type can change shape and size. So you think in terms of word count. So how many words are in the book? My longest book to date was 113,000 words, and it was Under Fragile Stone, which was the sequel to my first novel.
Yeah, I write history books as well. My longest history book is a history book on the island's revolution to escape the British Empire from 1919 to 21. My longest fiction book is Epics, just slightly longer than the others.
Well, my longest published book is called A Darkling Plain, and it's the 4th of the
the Mortal Engines books, and I can't remember how many words it is, but it's kind of about that thick. It's a big old doorstop of a book. But, you know, when I was writing this one, which is actually quite a short book, I kind of had to write it about 5 times with different plots. So that felt like the longest, and actually was. You know, if I published all the stuff I threw away, it would be that thick. So, go figure.
Okay, I think that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid, guys. Thank you so much for listening and for your questions.